I'm Diane Shapiro. I just want to say welcome everyone to our panel, Seafood for the Future, where we will explore regenerative ocean businesses and climate cuisine that are so important and exciting for our coastal communities here on the East End. Um, with me is my colleague, Mary Morgan. Mary is a co-founder and I'm an ambassador of Drawdown East End, a grassroots organization dedicated to advancing local climate solutions to reverse global warming. I started getting involved with understanding and protecting our East End waters through the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program, also known as SHERP, through the Stony Brook Southampton University, where we raised oysters and deposited eelgrass into Shinnecock Bay, which was really great fun, and I was so happy to do that. I'm also supporting the scalp renewal program so that oyster farmers can continue with their important mission of providing sustainable seafood and cleaning our waters. We have an exciting roundtable tonight with three very knowledgeable panelists. We will try to keep our roundtable to 50 minutes, so we will have a little time at the end for your questions and answers. Take it, Mary.
Thank you, Diane, and hello, everyone, and a big welcome to our panelists. We have Sean Barrett, Karen Rivara, and Chef Joe Realmuto. Thank you for joining tonight. You're welcome. Climate cuisine resonates with me. Climate cuisine, it's my love of local seafood started as a child. My uncle was a fisherman out of Montauk, and we delighted in whatever fish and shellfish he brought home. Always fresh, always local, in season, and delicious. I learned the value of cooking fish with a light touch, and I learned about conservation. Be good to the sea, and it will be good to you. Let me dive right in and introduce our first panelist, Sean Barrett. Sean is co-founder of Dock to Dish in Montauk, the first community-supported fishery in New York State, now with 45 fishermen, where chefs and individuals join and purchase a share of local seafood in advance. Sean is also on the board of Green Wave, a Connecticut nonprofit that has created a 3D restorative ocean farming model with plans to train 5,000 ocean farmers nationally. They've recently launched a campaign called Eat More Kelp. Welcome, Sean. And would you describe Dock to Dish, how it operates, its value to the community, and how it's now being used as a model for the world?
Yeah, sure. Mary, thanks very much for such a nice introduction, and thank everyone for putting together this seminar, for including us in the conversation. We're very grateful. It's great to see some of my old friends here, Joe, Karen. Yeah, I really loved your introduction, Mary, because my background is had similar roots to you. I grew up with same-day source seafood in Eastern Long Island, in Shinnecock, in Hampton Bays, a little to the west of Montauk. But that's what I grew up on and learned. And over the years, from the 1980s, 90s, we saw the marketplace change drastically. So realistically, what we did was we saw this problem that had arisen where, the markets that we knew on Long Island, on Eastern Long Island, which at one time were very heavily populated with mostly local seafood, the concept of knowing your fishermen, having direct relationships, really by the early 2000s, that market had really almost had diminished greatly. And statistically speaking, by about 2005, the United States was importing about over 90% of the seafood in the United States. And that was applicable to the East End of Long Island, which just seems so kind of crazy to us, that it was an island, that we had two robust, viable commercial fishing ports, the two largest in New York State, Shinnecock and Montauk. And yet a lot of the local restaurants and the markets, had these foreign fish during out of season, things that were totally unfamiliar to us. We began seeing things like tilapia and these curious things that, were just not what we understood to be even, seafood. So that really set myself and a couple of my buddies on this kind of quest to figure out how can we fix the broken system? How can we basically restore things back to a place, to how we knew them to be growing up? And that's really, I tell the story of Dr. Dish as the tale of two hills. And the first hill is Quail Hill, which is Quail Hill Farm. I'm sure most folks know in Amagansett. It's one of the oldest CSA operations in the country. It's actually the first CSA. So Scott Chasky is the farmer, poet, kind of legendary inspiration, a great mentor to me. He had written a book called This Common Ground, which I came across, which really was talked about the mechanics of operating a CSA and organic farm, but also the spirituality of interconnectedness and how his farm reconnected the community with his farm at Quail Hill. And so I was completely blown away by this. I had an epiphany and thought to myself, I wonder if, this is going back 10 or 11 years, I wonder if we couldn't try this for seafood, for fish. So I reached out to Scott and said, can we talk this through? We took a few winter walks this time of year at Quail Hill and just had some really good heart-to-hearts, and he kind of inspired me to give it a shot. So I had a few good buddies who are commercial fishermen. I got in touch with the Concerned Citizens of Montauk Association, and we formed a very kind of casual but a community-supported fishery, basically, just using Scott's model of how people could pay in advance for a share of seafood and access seafood directly from the fishermen. And to my kind of surprise, the concept took off like a rocket ship. We did hand select a lot of kind of well-known, well-respected folks from the community to be in our pilot program. And as most of you know, word of mouth travels pretty rapidly, especially if something's good. And so we ended up with these kind of big waiting lists, but that vision to have a community supported fishery was fulfilled. And we partnered with Amber Waves Farm and Scott Chasky, obviously at Quail Hill Farm. So people could come pick up their weekly vegetable share and their weekly fish share kind of in one fell swoop. And it was just a radical new market for seafood, like that had not been done before. But there were so we discovered some operational woes with that. Long Island has lost most of its working waterfront, so finding places to do fillet work and processing was really tricky and challenging. And so out of kind of desperation, two things happened at the same time. A friend that I used to work with long ago, he then worked at a place called Blue Hill at Stone Barns restaurant. He said, Dan Barber would like to meet you and talk about this concept, this community, this Dr. Dish community support fishery. That was the other hill, Blue Hill, in the tale of two hills, where I went and met with Dan. And this was in the same summer, I should say, that Scott Chasky and Stephanie Sachs, a few of my other good friends, I had long been a huge fan of Nick and Tony's and Joe's work. But right at about that same time, Joe and I got connected. And so suddenly I had Dan Barber and Joe Realmuto say, look, we'll sign up our restaurants to be members of your community supported fishery. And so almost by accident, we created the first restaurant supported fishery in the world. It was the first time that had ever been done. And so that summer, Joe and Dan Barber, they helped us to figure out everything from, delivery days to volumes to all that fun stuff. Poor Joe got put through the ringer with just the spontaneity of not knowing, a restoration of a true catch of the day. But especially in our early days, our communications were not great. And so the chefs were often caught by surprise by what was coming through their door. But, chefs like Joe and Dan Barber are of the same mindset, a very similar philosophy in their culinary training, which is, you get a knock on the back door from an artisan, a local producer, and it's the chef's job to take whatever that may be and craft and create a culinary, presentation for your guests from there. So this was a radically new, different way of thinking about seafood, basically, but it was a throwback to 100 years ago, to when whatever landed that day was what, pre-refrigeration, you basically, you were tied into whatever was local and seasonal and abundant. So We then had this kind of a rocket ship story of success with that. The Google Corporation ended up being an institutional member for us. And we really did, statistically speaking, if we go back 10 years ago, you know, a lot of the fishermen in the fleet will talk about just the concept of like knowing your fishermen and sourcing directly from the fleet, being really committed and loyal to what was local and seasonal, and being willing to accept from the ocean as opposed to trying to dictate to the ocean what you want. Those kind of concepts, I think, you know, have left an indelible mark and have changed the marketplace in Montauk, certainly. But then the model also we were able to replicate in a dozen other markets all over the place. We began to work with small fishing communities in Los Angeles, Vancouver, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, out in Fiji. We actually helped a community sport of fishery and restaurant sport of fishery in South Africa last year called Hook to Cook, and watched these programs kind of just flourish. So, but going back to our roots, Scott Chasky told me, like, you know, keep deep roots and then grow strong branches, which is a farmer's metaphor. And I told him, you know, Scott, I can dig it. And so we took that advice, and that has been our experience. But I think along the way, we owe a ton of gratitude. As they say, it takes a village. And that's been our experience. Folks like Joe is a great example of people who just kind of picked us up in the beginning and really, I mean, Scott Chasky, none of our work in fisheries would have been done. What we really did was to translate a lot of the work that we saw on land directly into the sea, and came up with this really incredibly sustainable model that's now been replicated in probably 12 or 13 different ports and areas around the hemisphere or different continents. So kind of a beyond our wildest dream situation. But what we learned from a regenerative perspective, especially in the United States has the most advanced fisheries laws and regulations in the world. And so we're kind of a beacon of light. And I know it's an interesting time in our country, but still our fisheries laws and the way that we manage our wild fisheries in the US is really seen as best in show. And so what that's been able to provide us is that we're now in the last 10 years, specifically in this kind of renaissance period, where if you're sourcing local US seafood, by definition, you're sourcing sustainable seafood. And without getting too into the weeds, the way that the US manages their fish stocks is they basically treat it like if you have a bank account balance that you can keep the same and just use the interest. That's how the United States, we have to build our fish stocks up to a certain biomass, and then US commercial fishermen are only, and that biomass will hold that fish population theoretically for future generations to have the same or equal or better access to, and US commercial fishermen are only allowed to harvest what's over that biomass level. I should say that regulatory framework works very well in the United States, and that is a regenerative system where the system's allowed to constantly regenerate and provide fresh seafood, but there are limitations there. And we've started now a few years back, but now we're really starting to see the impacts of climate change, which is just really throwing everything up in the air. A lot of the things that we used to know or we rely on, science is changing very rapidly. And so that was what really pushed me into, Brent Smith is the founder of Green Wave. And he and I at one time were we had different perspectives about the future of seafood. And he was very much about regenerative ocean farming. And I was very much advocating community supported fisheries and local well-managed wild fisheries as being the answer. And we were more or less, we were competitive, but there was time 10 years ago, we were also kind of combative, which was healthy and helped us to figure out our message and our relationship. We're very best of friends. I'm on the chairman of his board for a lot of years, and we work hand in hand for nearly a decade. But what we realized was that regenerative ocean farming and growing vegetables, and specifically sugar kelp, which we've just begun growing on the East End, absolutely has to be part of the seafood conversation, and actually rearranging what we know of as food from the sea, seafood. Historically, we've only known that to be, shellfish and fish and things like that, increasingly moving forward in a warming world, we need to start doing a lot more regenerative kelp farming and moving sea vegetables to the center of the plate, and some of our historical seafood offerings more towards the garnish and the side. So that's kind of where we're at with Dr. Dish, and with Green Wave. And Eat More Kelp is our most recent kind of building of awareness for folks to start basically hashtag Eat More Kelp. We realized in this era we had to have a very simple and pure message, and so that's really kind of what we're trying to get across to people these days. And Mary, I know you recently tried out, there's new coming to market right now. This is a really exciting time. We have a whole series of new kelp items, like kelp burgers, which Mary just tried. There's kelp jerkies, there's new seaweed salads that are coming out. And I know Joe has already expressed an incredible willingness to try this, but certainly Nick and Tony's in East Hampton, where I'm sure you guys are all familiar, has already begun tinkering with kelp and ocean vegetables in their on their menus and in their offerings. But certainly moving forward this summer and beyond, I think you're going to see Chef Real Muto is going to be the leader on the East End as far as regenerative sea vegetables, ocean farming, and kelp coming out of the oceans and onto dinner plates. So
I love hearing that, Sean. Yeah, it's really great. And it's we're going to put some links in the chat box about Eat More Kelp and Dr. Dish and Green Wave. And maybe we should segue over to Karen. Diane, what do you think?
We also have a video from
Oh, we have video. Great.
So please bear with me.
Do we have yeah.
The current industrial seafood model has led to a depletion of our oceans. But here at Google New York, we have an opportunity to influence and introduce a whole new way of eating and offering our seafood. We believe in supporting wild fishermen, but also believe that we have a chance to reimagine how we farm seafood. So we're working with two local fishermen, Dr. Dish and Thimble Island Oyster Company.
Sean Barrett, and I'm a co-founder of Dr. Dish, which is the first community supported fishery in Long Island. Our members are committing before the season and saying we're willing to surrender our traditional right to demand from fishermen and say, fishermen, go catch us this. It fundamentally changes the question to what have you caught today? So all of our members, the restaurants, they all know exactly who caught their fish, where it was caught, when it was caught, how it was caught, and all this really important information that we believe you have the right to know. And we've really disrupted the traditional chain of custody for seafood, which essentially from the fisherman's hands to the end consumer hand in the United States, that chain of custody, the amount of people who are actually taking possession of that fish before it goes from dock to dish, can have anywhere between 6, 10, 20, 30 different sets of hands, where Dr. Dish has come in and really kind of been pierced through that veil and created a new system that's only really 3 sets of hands. It's the fishermen, our cooperative and our management team here, and our members. Companies like Google and forward-thinking organizations are able to kind of say, this is the way that fisheries really should be operated. And so we're psyched to be working with you guys.
So my name is Bren Smith. I'm here in the Thimble Islands, and I'm the owner of Thimble Island Ocean Farm. What's innovative about urban sea farming is that we grow a whole range of species. We grow only things that are restorative, only things that require no fresh water, no fertilizer, no land, no animal feed, making it the most sustainable food on the planet. In a 1 acre area, I can grow up to 30 tons of kelp and a couple 100,000 shellfish per acre. Right? Incredible amount of volume. Our Our kelp soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants. Our oysters soak up nitrogen. Our entire farms function as artificial reef systems, which attract hundreds of different species. Our kelp can be used as biofuel, so we can actually start powering our farms with alternative energy. I think this model of choosing to grow just sustainable restorative species is really the direction we need to go. There are over 10,000 edible plants in the sea. Our job as fishermen farmers is to learn how to grow them and grow them well, grow good nutritious food. And that's really all we can do. Our job is then to hand them to the brilliant chefs at places like Google to innovate, to create new dishes of the future. What I think of, we're climate farmers, the chefs need to be develop a new climate cuisine. Stop trying to just search for the fish you want to eat, like salmon, like tuna. Choose to eat different things. Move plants to the center of the plate, sea greens to the center, bivalves to the center, and then do wild fish at the edges. We need to reorganize this plate for the future and the future of our oceans.
All right, Sean, do you also want to talk about this 2 graphs?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about those, Joanna, but maybe we can save those for the end. And I just want to make sure that Joe and Karen have enough time.
All right, so Karen.
I'd like to introduce Karen. Karen has a marine science degree from Southampton College. She fell in love with aquaculture working on a research project with the Shinnecock Tribe Oyster Project in 1983. She has worked in several shellfish hatcheries on Long Island and then started her own company, Arrows Cultured Oyster Company in Southold. She is a former head of the Long Island Farm Bureau and is currently president of the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. Welcome, Karen. As a longtime aquaculturist involved with hatcheries growing seed to replenish the bays, and as an oyster farmer, would you speak to us about the current status of sustainable shellfish, both wild and farmed, and their value in our bays and oceans?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody about seafood, and it's really fun to be on the panel with Sean and Joe. I remember when Sean started his whole project, so it's really cool to see. So I can basically, shellfish are filter feeders, and they're really an important part of the estuary. They're a keystone organism, at least the oysters are, and they filter the water. And it's shellfish farming. I'll take you through some slides just to show you how we do what we do, and also it starts off with why we do what we do. And it's really to build back a sustainable shell fishery. We have impacted our waters by urbanizing the shoreline, and so a lot of the waste from our houses goes into the water, especially here on the east end of Long Island, and creates excess nitrogen, which forms this, you could say it looks pretty, but it actually is not. It's the rust tide, and it will suck the oxygen out of the water and lower the pH, so it makes it really difficult for other marine organisms to survive when this algae bloom comes in. So one of the reasons that we have to grow shellfish in shellfish hatcheries like mine is because they are impacted in the natural waters, and it's very hard for them to build back their populations. And then you can go to the next slide. We also over-harvested our shellfish beds in the past. So that, coupled with the pollution, has made it very difficult for oysters to reestablish themselves. And the same is true with other shellfish like hard clams. And bay scallops now are being impacted by climate change, and we've lost 2 bay scallop seasons here on the east end of Long Island. The bay scallops just really didn't like the higher water temperatures. There's a theory that the cownose rays also came in. They're more of a warmer water fish, and devoured some of the bay scallops, and also a parasite that impacted them. So I'll just sort of take you through the process of how we are trying to bring these animals back. And it starts with a land-based facility. So you can go to the next slide. This is a map of Shellfisher Preserve. So the Peconic Land Trust was able to preserve the old Shelter Island Oyster Farm property in Southold. It's near Raiden Shores, and kept all of the aquaculture infrastructure intact, and is making it available to shellfish farmers like myself and my fellow cooperative members.
Nice.
And this is really important because, as Sean mentioned, there's very, very little working waterfront left on Long Island. And so this preservation has, you know, really helped my company establish itself. 35 other growers, so it's you know, by extension helped their companies grow, and then we also have 3 other growers that are based here. So so you need a land-based facility, and this is sort of an overview of what that looks like. And then you can go to the next slide. So this is my hatchery. I call it the bunker, and it's underground. And this was a facility that the Plaques set up. They basically wanted to use it to hold fat oysters in the summer just before they spawned. They wanted to hold them in tanks underground, keep them cool, and then corner the market with really fat, juicy oysters when everybody else's oysters had spawned out. So I've repurposed it to an oyster hatchery, or a shellfish hatchery. I do hard clams and bay scallops too. So so it all starts with the next slide. We have to get the animals to spawn. So this is an oyster spawning. We do this, we have 8 different groups each year that we spawn, and we start our first spawn the end of January, beginning of February. So we already have our first batch of larvae in our hatchery system. So, and I think the next slide will show you what, when we spawn, we have about 24 animals. So this is what it looks like when I collect the eggs from 11 females. You know, I have my hand in a bucket and you can't even see it at the bottom. So we're collecting a lot of eggs. Each female can put out about 50 million, 30 to 50 million eggs for each spawn. So that's a lot of oyster larvae. And then on the next slide, you'll see what they look like after they're about 24 hours old. And I don't know if there's audio on this. I made this for my grandson. So at the end it says, "I love you," but I do. I love all of you too. So, but this shows the larvae. So oysters and hard clams and bay scallops are actually larvae. They're freely swimming in the water for the first couple weeks of their life before they go through metamorphosis and settle. So with oysters, they're going to glue themselves to a hard surface, and that's where they stay for the rest of their lives. Hard clams will settle down to the bottom and sort of attach themselves to grains of sand to hold themselves down until they get big enough to be able to burrow down into the sand. And bay scallops will attach themselves to blades of eelgrass as their, you know, preferred habitat. But they'll attach themselves to things up off the bottom, but it's temporary. And they can also, when they get older, you know, they have that big muscle that they can use to open and close their shells, so they can actually swim and move from place to place. So, but they all start out looking like this. Okay, next slide is my algae culture system. So I have to grow the food to condition the oysters and hard clams and bay scallops to spawn, to grow the larvae, to grow the post set after they go through metamorphosis. So this is sort of like my field of corn and alfalfa and wheat that I'm feeding the animals. So the algae cultures are different colors because they're different species, and each species has a different food value to the animals at various stages of their life. And then the next slide will show you the inside of our hatchery. So these round tanks are where we're growing the larvae. And then you'll see to the right trays with little dark spots on there. Those are trays that have shell grit in them. And those dark spots are the oyster larvae that we've put in those trays with the shell grit, so they can search around and find their favorite piece of shell grit. And then they will attach to that and start growing and laying on shell. And once they attach to that shell grit, they start actually looking like an oyster, just a microscopic version, but they start taking on that oyster shape. And this is also how we can grow oysters for the restaurant trade, because when folks like Joe buy oysters, they want to have a single nice looking oyster to put on the plate for the customer. So these pieces of shell grit allow us to have an oyster settle and just maintain itself as an individual, as opposed to a bigger piece of shell where 1,000 of them are going to set on one piece of shell and just create this cluster that's really hard to manage. So that's how we start the oysters. And then the next slide is just an example of, we have to move them onto other tanks with water flowing through them when we're in the hatchery. So we're still holding on to them in a hatchery, feeding them and growing them to about the size of a pinhead. And then we're going to, you can go to the next slide. We'll move them outside. This is another type of, I think this is a video. You might be able to see it also if you click on it. Yeah. So these are new ways of growing shellfish, where they're called bupsies or bubblers, but they're columns and they have water coming from the bottom, and it fluidizes the bed of shellfish, and water constantly flows through, and you can feed them that way. So it's a very compact way of growing them, because again, our real estate on the water is very dear, so we're trying to grow as much as we can in as small of a footprint as we can. So, so I just wanted to show you a couple of different systems for that. And then the next slide is a floating upweller system. So then the seed is large enough that it can sit on a screen on the bottom of these barrels, and there's a motor at the end of the pipe that's moving the water through the pipe, and the only way it can flow through is to come up through the barrel and out the pipe. So we will grow shellfish seed in those barrels from about 1/8 of an inch to 1 inch in size, and it takes a very small footprint, and you can put one of these next to a dock, and it allows you to grow a lot of shellfish in a very small space. And then the next slide is that's what the dock system looks like, and the barrels look like out of the water. We have to pull them out of the water and run them through this machine to size separate them once a week, because they grow very quickly. And we're growing our shellfish for seed sales, so we want to keep them healthy and separate the fast growers from the slow growers on a regular basis. So we'll run them through this machine once a week. And yep, that's okay. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. Thank you. So this is a average size of the seed when they've been in that system for a week or so. They grow really quickly, but that's a handful of baby oysters, and just to show you what those look like. And then once they get bigger, we're moving them out into the bay. And in New York, we have to grow our shellfish in cages, sometimes because of the type of access we have to underwater land. But also because there are so many predators. So putting them in these bags and then putting the bags in the cages, again, it helps us keep a large amount of oysters in a small space, but it also protects them from predators. And when we want to handle them, we just lift up the cage, bring them on the boat. This is my boat. It's called the Pink Pearl. But we bring them on board, and then again are handling them, culling the fast growers from the slow growers, and taking out the market oysters for market. So this is off of my grounds in Southold. And then if the other method for growing oysters is to actually put them on the bottom, which is where they naturally grow. So in Connecticut, there are co-op members have beds over there, and they're in the Mystic River estuary, so they're able to actually plant the oysters on the bottom and then come back and scoop them up off the bottom with a dredge. And harvest them that way, and then clean up the bottom and replant it and keep the whole thing going. So that whole process was started around 2000, and since then we've seen a lot of oysters settling in other areas, and also have seen eelgrass start to reestablish in that estuary. And it's very easy in the Mystic River estuary to see these changes because it's such a small, tight estuary. We're very proud of the improvements to the water quality and the habitat since we started growing there over 20 years ago. Next slide. The other feature that we have at our farm is that we have a barn with a creek that runs under it, and so we can actually hold shellfish in the barn. In the winter time we can harvest from there. So this is sort of another harvest strategy that we have to access our animals. So we don't need a boat. It's very nice on cold winter days to come in here and harvest our oysters. And the next slide is just to show you, we also grow clams and bay scallops. The hard clams we grow for seed for other growers, and also plant on our grounds in Southold and Shelter Island. And last year I started working with Steve Tettelbach from Cornell Cooperative Extension and Bassem Alam from the University of Stony Brook to try and find populations of bay scallops that are more resilient to the increased water temperature that they've been experiencing lately, and see if we can breed some resistant bay scallops, and then hopefully get some of those seeded back into the bay, and basically start again with reestablishing the bay scallop population out there, because that's really an important economic engine for local fishermen in the wintertime. So and then there's a link here. If you click on that, it goes to this really great video that National Marine Fisheries Service did. And it's showing how, fish and other animals use our gear for habitat. I think this is the one. There's one of them where there's a fish actually spawning, but you can see they certainly enjoy it. And it's created really important habitat for finfish, because the eelgrass beds where they normally would live are diminished. So that was another sort of speaks to the sustainability of our industry. We also are finding what we call overset on, so this is an example of what we call recruitment. And it's overset of oysters on oysters we've grown. So the oysters we have spawned, and the larvae are swimming around, and some of them have found their way back to the mamas and papas, and they will pick those animals for their new home. So they'll glue themselves to an existing oyster. And it also shows you how these oyster beds are developed in nature, where you have younger oysters settling on older oysters and growing, and it's just sort of it continues to build until it's a bed of oysters. But this is what we call recruitment, and then we're seeing where oysters are coming back into the estuary from the spawn from the oysters that we're cultivating, which is good for habitat creation and improvement of water quality. Next slide. We're hoping on the east end to be able to also grow sugar kelp. So this is a picture of sugar kelp that's been seeded out for about a little under a month. So it's baby sugar kelp, and that's about what I would call our industry on the east end of Long Island. It's a baby. So we're hoping that it'll grow so that we can get those nice big lush plants that Green Wave is growing in Connecticut. But that's an example of what we're trying to accomplish over here. And then the other thing we're trying to accomplish is to sustainably produce a bounty from the sea so that we can all enjoy the fruits of our labor and slurp down some delicious oysters. And these are the Peconic Pearl oysters that I grow with my friend Melanie Douglas. And we take 5 cents for every oyster that's sold and donate it to the Peconic Pearls environmental program that's managed by the Peconic Land Trust. And then that program will fund projects that benefit the Bay, research projects, restoration projects, that type of things. So that's our project for building sustainability on our end of the seafood spectrum.
Great, Karen. That is like really fascinating. I could watch this like for the next couple of hours, all about this. But I do have to move on, and I wanted to ask you, speaking of kelp, do you see that the law changing in New York State happening anytime in the near future? Like right now, you cannot grow it commercially or sell it, although we can get it. Here on the East End, like you can go to Juice Press and get kelp noodles, which are really good. But do you see the law changing in the near future?
I think, well, there was a law that allowed for pilot program of kelp cultivation in the Peconics, and then in other parts of the Bay, they can, or I'm sorry, other parts of Long Island and the other bays and in the Sound, they can grow kelp. And I think that they will probably be able to grow it commercially soon, I would hope. I think our legislators understand that it's important to move forward on that.
Great, fingers crossed.
Yep.
That's good to hear. Yes. We're all writing letters in support of that. Growing kelp out here. Now let's move, thank you, Karen. Let's move on to our chef, Joe Realmuto, a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America. Do we still have Joe with us?
I'm still here.
Oh, good. Joe started his career at Nick and Tony's in East Hampton under Chef Paul Del Favero, and he has created and overseen and opened 4 additional restaurants under Honest Man Management Company, Rowdy Hall, La Fondita, Townline Barbecue, and Coche Comedor. Chef Joe oversees the organic garden at Nick and Tony's and is devoted to local produce, helped launch the Hayground School's Young Chefs program and the Springs School Seedling Project Greenhouse. He's also a member of Dock to Dish. And that's what I'd love you to talk about, Joe. Can you tell us how Dock to Dish works for you and maybe share a favorite local dish?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. And it's a hard group of panelists to follow up after. But yeah, I started out here, 28 years ago at Nick and Tony's for a summer, just kind of thinking I was going to spend a summer and go back to the city, which I did. I went back to the city for one more winter. And when Paul had called me to come back out, I had come back out. I said, all right, one more summer. And I came out and I just never left. I just kind of fell in love with having our own garden. And Scott Chasky, he was the one that actually tended to our garden, Peconic Land Trust. So building a relationship with him was pretty special. He's all about building the community. And back then, we had tons of local fishermen just coming to the back door. The bounty out here was huge, and not just with fishermen, but also with local farmers. And over, I would say when I started over the next 15 years, it all kind of started to disappear. All the local farmers disappeared, all the local fishermen stopped coming to the back doors, with extra fish that they had to use to fill their tags. And we became, kind of a product of what the market was, and giving customers what was kind of there for us, not necessarily what was in season. And it was a tough thing to kind of grasp, because when tomatoes are in season, you use tomatoes. When they're not in season, we just say we're not going to use them. There's a lot more vegetables than there are species of fish for us to cook in a kitchen. And then one year, when Sean started to launch Dr. Dish, he came to us, he reached out and met with myself and my partner, Mark Smith, and said, what do you guys think of this? And it seemed kind of crazy at first. You're going to pay for fish before you get it. You were going to get 100 pounds of fish delivered to your back door, and you're not going to know what it was. So it was a little bit scary, and also it was a little bit exciting as well. It was kind of like, you go, when you're in Europe, you're planning out your dinner, you go to the market. And even now, actually, things have turned around. You go to the farmer's market and you see what's available, and you figure out what you're going to feed everybody that night. So that's kind of what it was with Sean and Dr. Dish. He'd drop off a couple of coolers of fish. We'd open them up, and it was like, a surprise. All the cooks would actually come around and take a look to see what was in there. And, it was interesting because, part of the program, you would get 50 pounds of what, I forgot how he termed it. They were, fish that we were familiar with, local striped bass, tuna, mahi-mahi, really nice fish, stuff that that we were familiar with. I shouldn't say nice fish, fish that we were familiar with cooking. And then there was another 50 pounds of bycatch, which would be, 50 pounds of butterfish, skate wing, there was all kinds of, crazy things coming in, and we'd look at each other and we're like, okay, what are we going to do with this? And it kind of become, a little bit of, Iron Chef or Chopped. And, we go into the walk-in and we kind of design our menu, around what was being delivered to us, and one of the really nice things about it that really kind of drew us into it was, was a couple of things. One, that we were now supporting all of our local fishermen that were becoming a dying breed out here. I've made relationships over the time and talked to them about Dr. Dish and how it's helped them. They would get, let's say, 1,000 pounds of scallops, and they go to, the dock with it, and it gets shipped to, New York, and, they get 50 cents on the dollar of what they should be really getting, and, the program for us was a little bit expensive, but it was kind of a way of us giving back, which was really nice. That, there was no middlemen really involved. I mean, Sean was a middleman, but a lot of the money that we paid was going to the fishermen, which was really, really nice. And he was hand choosing fishermen that were using sustainable practices, that weren't overfishing, all the things that, we're talking about here, trying to keep sustainable, our ocean sustainable to kind of feed us for the rest of our lives. And a lot of that has disappeared, and it's with all the new changes and programs like these and education, not just with chefs, with also with our clientele. I think it's helping the whole process, which is really, really nice. The other thing that was really interesting to me was, how far your food really travels, and being here on the East End, you wouldn't think that you have striped bass on your plate during striped bass season, that fish wasn't landed on a boat, put in a truck, shipped to New York to the market, sat in ice crates there for a couple of days. Some of the fish purveyors from out here were going in to fill some of their quotas and their orders and bringing it back out here and then giving it to us, which that whole concept to me is really, really crazy. Why does our fish have to go from here to New York, sit there for a couple of days, come back out here, sit for a few more days, and then come to my walk-in? So, when Sean had said to me, your food is going to be caught and delivered to you within 24 hours, and you're going to be able to serve it to your customers super, super fresh. And that was really, really nice. And you could really see the quality in the product that we were serving. You know, the fish was just, I mean, it was pristine, you know, and we were getting them from fishermen that knew how to handle the fish, which was really nice. You know, they weren't being, you know, these big dragon nets, you know, pulling the stuff up, and they're being shoveled into, you know, the bottoms of boats and filled with ice. You know, they were, a lot of the stuff is line caught. And when they catch it, they know how to bleed it properly, how to ice it down properly. You know, they have a couple of other tricks up their sleeves, which are really, really interesting, to give you that pristine white flesh fish that is just, you know, remarkable. And being a chef and being able to get vegetables from your own garden or from local farmers out here, Balsam Farm and Quail Hill Farm, and then being able to match it up with a really quality, you know, centerpiece for the plate, it's just, it's bar none. You know, it's really, really nice. So,
Wow.
you know, we've really built some really nice relationships with some of the fishermen out here. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, you know, Sean has introduced a couple of people or sent them my way, so that we're still able to, you know, use a lot of this local stuff, which is really, really nice. And it's kind of changed the thinking of the chefs in my 5 restaurants on using local sustainable, you know, not just what's easy and what the customers want, you know, which is really, really important. So, you know, we have, even though we might not be buying directly from local fishermen all the time, we have these relationships with Gosman's and Braun. Okay, what is hitting your dock and how can we get it directly, you know, from you before it goes, you know, so they keep us, you know, in tune on what's local, what's being landed, and what we should be buying, which is really nice as well.
Fantastic. Were you going to share a recipe?
Well, you know, and one of the most interesting things that Sean had brought to me was dogfish. I mean, what you're looking at there, those are local scallops, but Sean had brought me some dogfish and said, have you ever cooked with this? And it was funny because, you know, all the years fishing, you know, I grew up fishing with my dad, my grandfather, my uncle, and then moving out here fishing, you know, with friends and my son. You know, you catch these dogfish, sand sharks, and we were throwing them back. And Sean said to me, you know, they're actually really good to eat. And so I did a little research on them, found out that they're highly used in England for fish and chips, you know. So he had taken me out to Montauk, and we went on one of the boats and that had just come in, and we grabbed a bunch, and he showed me how to actually butcher them, how to fillet them, because they're a lot like skate. You know, they release an ammonia, so they have to be super, super fresh. You have to fillet them right away, cook them, and serve them. It's not one of those fish that you want kind of sitting around in your refrigerator. And he said, you know, we want to do this piece for the New York Times, you know, would you play with the fish and see what you come up with? And it was almost immediate. I saw how delicious it was, and we came up with this great little recipe. It's super, super simple. You could get a link through it, I believe, through you guys. There's a whole recipe. But here we are out on the boat, you know, getting these beautiful fish. They call them dogfish because they actually fish. They swim in packs like dogs, and they're scavengers. You know, so that's kind of where they got their names, the sand sharks. There's one of the pictures of, I believe it was Sean actually filleting it, showing us kind of really how to, there you go, how to keep it super fresh. You know, I mean, you can see that fish is just beautiful. You know, and in our cooking in our restaurants, we like to keep everything super, super simple. So whatever's seasonal, it was summertime, we grab some spring onions from our garden, some fresh thyme, some zucchini, some local tomatoes, baby fennel. And, you know, we sauteed the fish, you know, really quick, really, really hot, just seasoned it up with a little salt and pepper, got it really hot. And then, you know, just added the cooked vegetables to it, a little bit of white wine, butter, and added the fresh herbs. And it just kind of made this beautiful little dish.
That looks fabulous.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just super simple, you know, and you know, fishermen, you know, even just sport fishermen like myself, you catch a lot of fish, whether they're a lionfish or, you just kind of throw these things back, So since I've met Sean, I've learned to take these fish and see what we can actually do with them, And one of my biggest failures is false albacore. I was out fishing with a friend, and there was just so many albacore out there, and we catch them. It's such a beautiful fish. And he says, you can't eat them, you can't eat them. And we made a day trip, and we caught them, and we tried everything in our power to make these things taste good, and just wasn't able to do it.
Wow. Sean had mentioned the term climate cuisine, Joe, and I wondered if you have used that in your restaurants, and also if your customers, people have been surprised about the variety of local fish.
Absolutely. When we started with Dr. Dish, Sean would come in and he would educate our front of the house staff as well, what we were doing in-house as well. And we would promote it, and people would look forward to getting it. I mean, we'd get 100 pounds of fish and on a Thursday, and we basically sell out of it by Friday night in the summertime. So people would look forward to it. But yeah, that was something, that Jeff and Tony, when they started the restaurant, climate-based menus is what's available is what you serve, whether it be vegetables, whether it be fish, wintertime game birds would come around. I mean, it spans across the whole menu. And we try to follow that as much as we could, and at Nick and Tony's, it's super, super easy. And Coach Commodore, it's really easy, because we're able to kind of just constantly change our menus on the fly. We'll get a call and somebody will say, we got these beautiful, dayboat scallops, and we'll reprint our menus and we'll put them on, so it is a super, super important thing to our restaurant group.
Absolutely. You're known for local, in season. It's fantastic. And we actually put some information about your restaurants in the chat box, I believe. And Diane, do we have time for a quick lightning round?
Oh, yes. We have time for questions. I think Joanna has a bunch of them in the chat and in the Q&A. So Joanna, you want to?
Sure. I'm going to start with Jeremy's question. What kinds of effects of climate change are you seeing on the fisheries? I'm not sure.
What was the question?
What kind of effects of climate change are you seeing on your fisheries?
Would that be for Sean?
I guess so.
Yeah, I can feel that one. I think so. As Karen had mentioned before, obviously the bay scallops, we're seeing water temperature rise. There's often a series of reasons for these things happening, but most noticeable to us is migration pattern shifts. So everyone remembers the iconic Long Island lobster. You really don't see too many of those around anymore, but they are a boom population up in the Gulf of Maine. And so we're starting to see species of fish kind of migrating north. I think a great example of that, black sea bass, which actually we saw in Karen's video. There was kind of a very healthy population of them hanging out on one of her cages there. And so that historically, black sea bass is a North Carolina based species. So we've always had them in New York. We just have not had them like we have them now. So as the waters are slowly warming, species of fish are slowly moving north. And so that would be the equivalent, like it's when you're dealing with fish and you're seeing this in the ocean, it's invisible and people on land don't really get to see it, but it would be the land equivalent. If you were standing at the Eiffel Tower and a herd of zebra and wildebeest came running by, you would be kind of alarmed by that. And that's essentially what we're seeing is this migration shifts up the coast. I think that the target population for black sea bass in the northern mid-Atlantic where we are, we're somewhere in the range of like 250 to 300% of our target population. They've just really overrun the area. And so I think that would be probably the first thing you would point to is to look to like the bay scallop situation and warming waters just wiping out a local species. And then also species from the south that are moving north, or species that used to be indigenous and local to us in Long Island that have also moved north. This kind of migration pattern shift is the most obvious that we're dealing with right now.
Sean, you would say also, you know, I noticed this year the amount of mahi that I saw come off the boats right at Montauk was, you know, staggering, you know.
Yeah.
And when I tell people, you know, we're serving local mahi, they're like, where are you getting mahi from? And I said, it's coming right from Montauk. They said, it's a, you know, a southern fish. You know, how are you getting?
Yeah, great point there too, Joe. So that's historically a very southern species, but in certain times of year, late July into August, maybe a few weeks into September, the mahis will actually ride up the hot water of the Gulf Stream, where our Montauk boats, day boats, can go out there, overnight boats, and run into them. And so that's a great example of like just a boom mahi species in the northernmost. We're the northernmost port in the Mid-Atlantic region. To see that volume statistically, like a record-breaking year of southern species being landed locally, and not just mahi is a great species to look at and identify, but when you see that happening in a lot of these species happening, right? Like that's where you see these major trends happening. I think that's probably the most alarming thing. There was a sailfish in the Cape Cod Canal 2 summers ago. You know, just all these anomalies, a brown pelican in the Hudson River last week. So not only fish, but also birds, sea birds, that we're seeing these kind of crazy migration pattern shifts happening that you're just like, whoa, man, it's real.
Wow. You know, you had an interesting slide, Sean, that you were going to show us about what in the fish market, what we should be looking, you know, what the travel time of fish. I thought it was really interesting to share.
Yeah, that's a great slide, and it's a lot of the work we've done with Joe. It's also what makes working with Joe and his partner Mark Smith such a dream come true for us, because they're already so inculcated in having this local philosophy and direct relationships with their producers. But this is a great example. 2 years ago, we worked with the Monterey Bay Aquarium to do a study. They now have this tool available on their website where you can actually measure the carbon footprint of your seafood. And when you get into food miles, and as Joe mentioned, how kind of just off the wall crazy it is, the way that seafood travels around the planet right now. This, what should be a very local kind of food source, has become a global item. And so when you start to look at, especially when fish gets put into an airplane, which, because fresh fish has to travel so fast, it's very highly perishable. So it's shocking also the circuitous routes, like Joe mentioned, like Montauk fish landing and going to the city, waiting a few days, coming back, sitting in a shop a few days before it gets to Joe. That's a small scale example of like the global scene, where like the carbon footprint on the food miles, if you look at some of the averages in this chart here, the average food mile for a seafood in the United States is about 5,000 miles, and most of that travels by air, which is Alaska to Key West far, for every seafood dish, if you can think about the amount of carbon that's being generated there. So when Joe talks about, or when we talk about climate cuisine, Joe and his operations are what we kind of use as the model, because they are so dedicated and loyal to sourcing locally, low carbon footprint, you know, low food miles. Joe's partner, Mark, one time, he used to time us from the time we got from the dock, the fish landed, until it got to his walk-in. But you know, from Montauk to East Hampton, I think, Joe, what was our record time? It was the speed limit, so we don't get in trouble, but I think it was something like
probably around 20 minutes.
Yeah. So not summertime, obviously, but you know, just having that hyper local philosophy that Joe has really been such an incredible you know, warrior and advocate and ambassador for just hyper local sourcing. That really is the key to getting us, you know, single digit carbon food miles. When you see like the Dr. Dish, our average food miles is somewhere in the range of, it's double digits, as opposed to like, you know, the national average, which is orders of magnitude larger than that. So yeah, food miles and carbon footprint, extremely important to keep in mind when you're making seafood choices.
Oh, there,
yeah, here you go.
That's a great slide. I love that.
Yeah, so you may be being told like, oh, well, our salmon is sustainable, our Vancouver salmon, but like, look at the stats here. For every, you know, piece of salmon that's flown across the country, 2,500 miles, and 2,375 tons of carbon have been emitted for that fish to travel that far. So the old days of the criteria that we used to use to gauge sustainability it didn't even discuss food miles really, or carbon footprints or carbon emissions. Only in the last 3 to 5 to 6 years has that conversation completely flipped upside down. And now food miles and carbon footprint and carbon emissions is becoming like the #1 thing that we talk about when you're talking about sustainable seafood. Once again, what makes Karen's work and Joe's work so important to us is that like this hyper local, basically, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So Joe's kind of traditional methods and philosophy of how he sources is really what we're trying to advocate most everyone to follow Joe's lead.
I have a question for Karen. When did Peconigo Land Trust secure that property in Southold?
I believe it was 1996.
Okay, and how many people are involved in your company?
In my company, I have myself and 2 full-time and 1 part-time employee. And then also Melanie Douglas grows the Peconic pearls with me. And then we have 2 other companies that are based out of that property too.
Okay, I guess this question is also for you. Some of us are working towards the Long Island Zero Waste Plan. What sorts of waste does your fishery create? What do you do with that? And what sorts of waste should we be concerned?
Waste from the production of shellfish?
Yes.
I mean, we use boats to go out and harvest, so we're burning gasoline until they make electric boats for us. But our gear that we use, we use it until it's broken. So sometimes our cages will break down and we'll have to scrap those and get new ones. The bags are made out of plastic, so they last a long time. So we don't have to really replace those. And then the hatchery, in order to grow shellfish in January, I do have to heat the hatchery. So, but we're hoping to work with the land trust to put solar panels on top of that big long barn that I had a picture of, so that we can at least, cut down on the amount of BTUs it takes to grow shellfish.
There's a question about kelp, and maybe Karen could answer it, but I'd also like to hear about Eat More Kelp. The question is, please put a call out for constituents to support commercial kelp farming. And they mentioned Fred Thiel's office. What is the call out? Karen, do you know?
Not particularly, but I think what it is that we want to expand the kelp production from sort of a pilot scale research level to commercial, and Assemblyman Thiel has been really supportive of both the commercial fisheries and aquaculture on Long Island. So if anybody is going to lead the charge, it would be Assemblyman Thiel.
So it's a state law that has to change?
Yes, because of the way the laws are written in terms of what you can grow on these parcels of underwater land. It's for shellfish, and they need to change it to allow for kelp too.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Sean, you're involved with Eat More Kelp, and that, I guess the kelp that's being raised is non-New York State that would be involved with the Eat More Kelp program?
Yeah, Mary, is my mute on, or can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so exactly as Karen said, there's kind of 2 buckets. One is the growing kelp part, which there is kind of some, and that's what Scott, my buddy Scott, is on here. And I would encourage everyone to push through and make calls and sign letters with Assemblyman Thiel's office. He is a great advocate for fisheries and a good ally, but sometimes they need a nudge. There is a kelp bill that's in the New York State Senate right now that we've got pushed through. I serve on the Marine Resources Advisory Council at the DEC, where we work on a lot of this stuff. And so right now the tangle is in growing it, as Karen said, on certain bottoms that are only designated for shellfish. We really need to get that to say end kelp. But there are a few other kind of tentacles off the conversation that have to deal with like food safety and having the kelp evaluated for heavy metals and things like that. We really don't feel confident putting New York State kelp into the food system until we get a lot of that science done. Green Wave is doing a lot of that science as we speak. In the first New York State, we have about 16 test sites right now all over the East End, all to the east of the Shinnecock, actually mostly to the east of the Shinnecock Canal, that are going to be harvested this spring, which is our really exciting kind of time for New York. It's rare. And big shout out to my friend Linda LaViolette. I see her from Ag and Markets. It's the first, 2021 will be the first kind of kelp crop harvest for New York State, which is super exciting. But before we can get that into the food supply, Mary, there's a kind of series of, we can sell it. We can actually sell kelp, right? The DEC is like, yeah, there's no laws. And unfortunately, there's also no laws against wild kelp. So you can go out and harvest wild, which we definitely do not recommend. But what's happening is that the kelp is kind of conversation is moving faster than the laws have really been written. So other states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine has a very robust kelp industry. We're safe and good to import kelp from those states. And anytime New York State has to import a food item from another state, the legislatures typically don't like that. So we're hoping to get it accelerated and move a lot of this stuff through. But so right now we have Eat More Kelp as an awareness campaign, and we're advocating people to eat more kelp, unfortunately right now, from Maine and from Alaska and from other states where it's illegal food stuff.
Well, I know Diane and I both have become, interested in eating more kelp. Me with the kelp burgers from Maine, and Diane had some kelp products that were local.
Kelp noodles.
Yeah, we get by with a little kelp from our friends. We like to say.
I have a question here from Abigail. She's interested as a consumer. She'd like to know where she can buy some local seafood and vegetables, and she lives in West Hampton.
Go have dinner at Nick and Tony's.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think the big answer to that is actually go to the local fish markets and actually talk to them and ask them what is local, where is it, where did it come from, and I think they'll be very open to directing you and having that conversation with you. And there's a lot of small family-run fish markets, on Long Island, there's, so you could always source it out.
And a lot of it's also very hyper local. So Joe's in East Hampton, obviously he has access to some of the better markets on the further East End. But if you're in West Hampton, I'd advise Haskell's in Quag is a really good, reputable character. A good guy I've worked with a lot of years. And as Joe had mentioned, transparency is the key. Also educating yourself and kind of knowing what's local and what to look for. But over the last few years, there's been a lot of emphasis put on transparency in the local supply chains and a much more educated consumer, which is where all of you guys come in. So as Joe mentioned, the best thing you could do is just pepper as many questions as you possibly can at your fish market. And these days, you'll typically get good answers. And as far as vegetables, I highly recommend getting a CSA. Amber Waves, Quail Hill, my all-time favorite. There was a time when we were in a barter system where we would trade fish shares for veggie shares. Some summers, Joe, you remember I used to end up with and trading Carissa's breads. We had a whole underground system with all the suppliers trading, artisanal goods. And so CSAs is a great way to get hyper local, super fresh, seasonal, delicious vegetables directly from the farm. So I know that Quail Hill and Amber Waves, which are two Peconic Land Trust projects, I think that their spring seasons are opening right now to sign up for a CSA. That's by far my favorite way to get the best local veggies and produce.
Yep. And the only other thing I'd add to that is if you're driving through Southold, we have oyster farm stands. So the oyster growers have little roadside stands where they're selling the oysters. You grab a bag, leave the money in the box, and or Venmo, and enjoy fresh oysters right from the farmer.
Leave a tip. Don't be shellfish.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's a great way to round up the ending here, and with CSAs and fish markets and oyster farm stands, and maybe we'll see everybody at the next farmers market. That hopefully that'll open up this spring. everyone is going to receive an email at the app tomorrow or the next day about the chat, what questions from the chat box that may not have been answered, and also some more further links. I just want to thank everybody for joining us, especially our terrific panelists, Karen, Sean, and Joe. Really great that you're involved in promoting regenerative seafood and climate cuisine. I love that. So important for our East End. I think we can all get on board with this. Really, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm going to turn this over to Joanna to close out.
Sure, please join us next week for sustainable fashion. It's Tuesday at 7. I forget what the day. I think it's the 23rd. So that will be the last drawdown for the future. So I hope we will see you there. And all the questions we didn't get to answer, we will definitely try to. So please be patient with us, and there will be video coming from this presentation and the presentation we did last week. So you will probably see the links for that as well. All right, so thank you so much. Thank you all the panelists. Terry, would you like to say anything?
Just thank you very much. This was really interesting, fascinating, and I hope we have more of these.
Definitely.
All of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.